What happens when a group of teenagers mocks a frail veteran selling poppies? They laughed at his faded uniform, but his next words left them speechless. I've stood on this corner of Maple Street and Willow Creek more times than I can count, my old uniform pressed crisp despite its years, the weight of a cardboard box of poppies in my hands. My name's Henry Caldwell, and at 78, I'm not much to look at. Wiry, a little stooped, with hands that shake if I don't keep them busy. But this uniform, faded olive green with a row of ribbons pinned above my heart, still fits like a second skin. Every Memorial Day weekend, I'm out here, offering red paper poppies to folks passing by, collecting what they can spare for veterans who gave more than most will ever know. It's not about me. Never has been. It's about them. Those who didn't come home, or came home broken. The sun was hanging low that Saturday, painting the cracked pavement gold, and Willow Creek buzzed with its usual rhythm. Families strolled past the diner, their chatter mixing with the clink of dishes through the open windows. Kids darted across the park, their laughter sharp against the hum of a distant lawnmower. I stood outside the community center, my tin can on a folding table beside me, a few crumpled bills and coins inside. "Support our veterans," I said to a young mother pushing a stroller, handing her a poppy with a smile. She tucked it into her toddler's blanket, dropped $1 in the can, and thanked me with a nod before hurrying off. Her kid giggled, waving the poppy like a flag. Moments like that, they keep you going. I adjusted my cap, the one I've worn since Korea, its brim worn thin from years of handling. That's when I heard it, a snicker, sharp and mean, from a group of teenagers loitering near the community center's glass doors. There were 5 of them, maybe 16 years old, all hoodies and sneakers, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. The ringleader, a lanky kid with messy dark hair and a smirk that could curdle milk, stepped forward. His name, I'd learn later, was Jake Turner. "Hey, old man," he called, loud enough to turn heads. "What's with the costume? You raiding a thrift store or what?" I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady, the way I learned to when shells were screaming overhead. "No costume, son," I said, meeting his eyes. "This is a uniform, worn by folks who served." I held up a poppy, offering it like I always do, hoping to steer things back to calm. Jake laughed, a harsh bark that set his friends giggling. He sauntered closer, hands in his pockets, his posture all bravado. "Served? What, like you mopped floors at the army base?" His friends howled. One of them, a kid with a buzz cut, mimicking a salute so sloppy it was almost a dance move. A girl with purple streaks in her hair, Sarah, pulled out her phone and started filming, her grin wide. "Yo, this guy thinks he's in a war movie," she said, zooming in on my face. "I've seen worse than a pack of mouthy kids. Far worse. But there's a sting to being mocked for something you've carried in your bones for decades." I adjusted my cap again, feeling the familiar weight of the ribbons on my chest. "I'm just raising funds for veterans," I said, keeping my tone even. "You want to help? I'd be grateful." "Help?" Jake sneered, stepping so close I could smell the bubblegum on his breath. "You're out here looking like a fossil, begging for change. Get a real job." He flicked the brim of my cap, knocking it askew, and his friends roared with laughter. The crowd, shoppers pausing with their bags, kids on bikes, a guy in a gas station uniform, watched, their murmurs growing uneasy. A man in a flannel shirt took a step forward, then stopped, unsure. I straightened my cap, slow and deliberate, and looked Jake in the eye. "Son," I said, "I'm not begging. I'm giving you a chance to do something worthwhile." "Worthwhile?" Sarah chimed in, her phone still rolling. "You look like you're about to keel over. Bet you never even held a rifle." Her friends laughed harder, and the crowd's unease thickened. I could feel their eyes on me, some pitying, some curious, some just waiting for the next move in this ugly little drama. I set the box of poppies down, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping calm. I've faced down worse than these kids. But there's a kind of pain in being reduced to a punchline, especially when you're standing for something bigger than yourself. "I've seen worse than you," I said quietly, "and it wasn't right then either." That's when Jake crossed a line. He snatched a poppy from my box and crushed it in his fist, letting the red petals drift to the pavement like spilled blood. "Oops," he said, his smirk wide. "Guess I don't need your fake flowers." Sarah zoomed in, narrating, "Check out Jake owning this guy." The crowd gasped, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the kind that comes when you see something sacred treated like trash. I knelt, my knees creaking, and started picking up the petals, one by one. Each one felt heavier than it should, like a memory I'd buried long ago. The kids laughed, but the crowd's mood shifted. A woman named Ellen, who runs the bakery across the street, stepped out, her apron dusted with flour, her face like thunder. "That's enough!" she shouted, her voice slicing through the noise. "You leave him alone! You hear me?" Jake turned, his smirk faltering. "Mind your own business, lady," he said, but his bravado was thinning. Ellen didn't back down. "You're the one making a fool of yourself picking on an old man," she shot back. "Grow up!" The crowd grew thicker, drawn by the commotion. A man in a suit, briefcase in hand, slowed his pace, his brow furrowed. Kids on scooters whispered to each other, their eyes wide. I stood, the petals clutched in my hand, and looked at Jake. "You don't respect this," I said, nodding to the tin can. "That's your choice. But it's not just about me." Jake's face hardened, and he stepped closer, towering over me. "You think you're tough, old man? You're nothing." He shoved my shoulder, not hard enough to knock me down, but enough to make me stumble. The crowd gasped again, and Ellen started forward, but I raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not here to fight," I said, my voice low but clear. "I'm here for them." I pointed to the tin can, where a few dollars and coins sat, a small tribute to those who'd given everything. Jake opened his mouth, but a new voice cut through, a deep, commanding tone from the edge of the crowd. "What's going on here?" A police officer, his name tag reading Daniels, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene. The crowd parted, their murmurs quieting. He took in my uniform, the crushed petals, the teenagers' smirks. I stood my ground, the tin can in my hands, and felt the weight of every eye on me. I didn't need their pity. I just needed to finish what I started. Daniels looked at me, his tone respectful. "You all right, sir?" "I'm fine," I said, meeting his eyes. "Just doing my part." He turned to Jake, his face hardening. "Pick up those petals. Now." Jake hesitated, his bravado cracking. But Sarah whispered, "Don't let him win, Jake." The crowd watched, the air thick with questions. Who was I, really? And what would happen next? Asterisk, you won't believe who stood up for me next. This is just the start. It gets tougher from here. I stood there on Maple Street, the weight of my tin can heavy in my hands, the crushed poppy petals still tucked in my pocket like a bruise that wouldn't fade. The twilight was creeping in, casting long shadows across the pavement of Willow Creek, where the crowd's murmurs buzzed like flies around a wound. I'm Henry Caldwell, 78 years old, a man who's seen more than most, and I was just trying to do right by those who can't stand here anymore. My uniform, faded but proud, clung to me like an old friend, its ribbons a quiet reminder of battles fought long ago. But right now, those battles felt closer than ever. Officer Daniels, a broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, stood between me and Jake Turner, the lanky kid who'd turned my simple act of selling poppies into a public shaming. Jake's friends, 5 of them, all smirks and swagger, hovered behind him, their laughter fading under Daniel's glare. The crowd, now swollen with shoppers, kids on bikes, and locals drawn by the commotion, watched with a mix of anger and unease. Ellen, the bakery owner with flour-dusted hands and a fire in her eyes, stood nearby, her arms crossed like she was ready to march into battle herself. Jake, his dark hair falling into his eyes, tried to play it cool. "We were just messing around, officer," he said, his voice dripping with a confidence that didn't match his twitching hands. "No need to blow this out of proportion." His friends nodded, but Sarah, the girl with purple streaks in her hair, slipped her phone into her pocket, her earlier bravado dimming like a candle in the wind. Daniels didn't blink. He pointed to the scattered poppy petals on the ground, their red stark against the gray pavement. "Pick them up," he said, his voice low and unyielding, the kind that makes you stand straighter even if you're not in trouble. "And apologize to this man." I watched Jake's face flush, his smirk faltering like a bad actor forgetting his lines. He glanced at his friends, who suddenly found the cracks in the pavement fascinating. The crowd's murmurs grew sharper, some whispering, "He's got no shame," others muttering, "Kids these days." Ellen's eyes burned into Jake, daring him to push further. I adjusted my cap, feeling the familiar weight of it, and kept my gaze steady. I've faced worse than a mouthy kid. Mortars, ambushes, nights where the cold sank into your bones. But there's a different kind of pain when your honor's dragged through the dirt. "Apologize?" Jake scoffed, crossing his arms. "For what? He's just some old guy playing soldier." His voice carried, and the crowd sucked in a collective breath. I felt it. That sting deep in my chest, like a memory of a wound I'd long since buried. But I didn't flinch. "I'm not playing, son," I said, my voice quiet but firm, the way I used to speak to green recruits who thought they knew it all. "I'm raising funds for veterans, men and women who gave more than you'll ever understand." The crowd stirred, some nodding, others whispering support. A woman with a stroller clutched her child's hand, her eyes soft with sympathy. But Jake wasn't done. He stepped closer, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. "You're out here begging, old man! That's all this is!" He kicked my tin can, sending it skittering across the ground. Coins spilled out, glinting like scattered stars, and a few poppies fluttered from the box in my hands. The crowd gasped, and I felt that ache again, sharper now, like a blade twisting in my gut. I knelt, my knees protesting, and started gathering the coins, each one a small piece of someone's gratitude for those I stood for. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, not looking up. "These aren't just coins. They're for men who didn't come home, for women who left pieces of themselves on fields you'll never see." My voice trembled. Not from weakness, but from the weight of names I hadn't spoken in years, friends who'd laughed with me, fought with me, died beside me. Jake laughed, but it was hollow, like he knew he was losing ground. "Whatever, man," he said, turning to his friends. "This guy's a joke." But Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice low. "Jake, just say sorry and let's go." Her eyes flicked to Daniels, who stood like a wall, unyielding. I stood, the tin can dented but still mine, and looked at Jake. "You've got a choice," I said. "Walk away or keep digging yourself deeper." There was no anger in my voice, just a tired certainty, the kind that comes from seeing too many kids like him think they're untouchable. That's when things got uglier. A second officer, a woman named Ruiz, arrived, her boots clicking on the pavement. She took one look at the scene. Me with my tin can, the spilled coins, Jake's defiance, and stepped in beside Daniels. "Everybody back up," she said, her voice sharp but calm. "Let's keep this under control." But control was slipping. Jake's friends, sensing the tide turning, started to back away, but another kid, stocky with a buzz cut named Tyler, decided to double down. He picked up a coin from the ground and flicked it at me, the metal bouncing off my shoulder. "Here's your charity, old man," he sneered. The crowd gasped again, and Ellen surged forward, her face red. "You little punk," she snapped. "You think you're tough, picking on someone who's done more than you'll ever dream of?" I raised a hand, stopping her. "Ellen, I appreciate it," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But I've handled worse than this. I've stood in foxholes with shells screaming overhead, watched friends bleed out in the mud. A kid's taunt? That's just noise. But it still hurt, the way a splinter hurts. Not deep, but persistent." The crowd was growing, their voices rising. A man in a flannel shirt shouted, "Leave him alone!" A woman with gray hair nodded, muttering, "Disgraceful." I felt their support, but I also felt the weight of their pity, and that stung worse than Jake's words. I didn't want pity. I wanted to finish what I started. Then a new voice cut through, sharp and officious. "What's going on here?" Richard Hayes, the community center manager, strode forward, his suit pristine, a clipboard under his arm. He was in his 50s, with a face that said he liked order more than people. He glanced at me, then at the officers, his lips pursed. "This is private property. If there's a problem, take it elsewhere." Daniels turned, his patience fraying like an old rope. "We're handling a disturbance, sir." This man was harassed while raising funds for veterans. Hayes raised an eyebrow, looking at my uniform like it was something he'd find in a thrift shop. "Fundraising? Does he have a permit?" The crowd groaned, and Ellen threw up her hands. "A permit?" she snapped. "He's selling poppies for veterans, not running a circus. Have some decency." I reached into my pocket, pulling out the folded permit I always carry. "Right here," I said, handing it to Hayes. He scanned it, his frown deepening, then shoved it back at me. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "But you're causing a scene. Maybe you should pack up and go." The crowd's murmurs turned to shouts. "He's not the problem," a woman called. "Shame on you," another added. I tucked the permit away, my hand steady despite the tremor in my fingers. "I'll stay until I'm done," I said, looking Hayes in the eye. "I've got a job to do." Hayes bristled, his clipboard clutched like a shield. "This isn't a battlefield, sir. You're disrupting the peace." Jake, sensing an ally, grinned. "Yeah, even the boss says you're a problem, old man." He stepped closer, his voice loud. "Why don't you just go home? Nobody wants you here." I looked at him, then at the crowd, their faces a mix of anger and hope. I thought of the men I'd served with, the ones who never got to grow old, and I felt that ache again, sharp and deep. "Nobody?" I said softly, nodding to the tin can. "They do." The crowd roared, and I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Asterisk, what happens next? Nobody saw it coming. But it's going to change everything. The air on Maple Street was thick as molasses, heavy with the weight of 100 eyes and the sharp edge of whispered outrage. I stood there, Henry Caldwell, 78 years old, my faded uniform clinging to my frame like a memory that wouldn't let go. The dented tin can in my hands held coins and bills for veterans who'd given more than anyone here could fathom, and the single poppy petal in my pocket felt like a shard of something sacred. Twilight had settled over Willow Creek, painting the pavement in hues of purple and gray, and the crowd, shoppers, kids, neighbors, watched me like I was the last man standing on some forgotten hill. I wasn't here for their pity. I was here for the ones who couldn't stand at all. Jake Turner, the lanky kid who'd turned my quiet afternoon into a public trial, stood a few feet away, his smirk fading under the glare of Officer Daniels and Officer Ruiz. His friends, a gaggle of teenagers with more bravado than sense, hovered behind him, their laughter long gone. Ellen, the bakery owner with flour on her apron and fire in her soul, stood with her arms crossed, ready to take on the world for me. Richard Hayes, the community center manager, clutched his clipboard like it could shield him from the crowd's growing anger. He'd just told me to pack up and leave, as if I were the one causing trouble. Jake, sensing a chance to save face, had echoed him, sneering, "Nobody wants you here." I looked at the kid, his eyes defiant but flickering with doubt, and then at the tin can in my hands. "Nobody," I said, my voice low, steady, the way I used to speak when the world was chaos and I had to hold the line. "They do." I nodded to the can, to the donations for men and women who'd faced hell so kids like Jake could stand here and spit on their memory. The crowd stirred, their murmurs rising like a tide. A woman with gray hair clutched her purse, her eyes wet. A man in a flannel shirt shouted, "He's right!" and others echoed him, their voices a chorus of indignation. Hayes, his suit crisp but his face sour, tried to regain control. "This is private property," he said, his voice thin as a reed. "I'm just trying to keep things orderly." He looked at me like I was a problem to be swept away, and I felt that old ache in my chest, the kind that comes when you realize the world's forgotten what you stood for. Ellen wasn't having it. "Orderly," she snapped, stepping forward, her hands on her hips. "You're letting these kids disrespect a veteran, and you're worried about orderly asterisk? You ought to be ashamed, Richard Hayes." The crowd roared, some clapping, others shouting, "Let him stay! And show some respect!" I raised a hand, trying to calm them. "Folks, I appreciate it," I said, "but I'm not here to stir up trouble. I just want to finish what I started." Jake, his bravado crumbling, tried one last jab. "You're still just an old guy in a costume," he said, but his voice cracked, and his friends looked away, their faces flushed. Officer Daniels stepped closer, his eyes like steel. "One more word, kid, and you're in cuffs," he said. "You've done enough." I looked at Jake, seeing not just a kid, but a mirror of every hot-headed recruit I'd ever trained, full of fire, short on wisdom. "You've got time to learn, son," I said, my voice softer than I felt. "Don't waste it." The crowd quieted, their eyes on me, and I felt the weight of their hope, their anger, their need for something to make this right. That's when I heard it, a low rumble, like thunder rolling in from the edge of town. Heads turned as a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up, followed by a desert-tan Humvee that looked like it belonged in a war zone, not Willow Creek. The vehicle stopped, and the crowd parted, their whispers buzzing like static. 3 men stepped out of the SUV, their military uniforms crisp, their boots gleaming under the streetlights. The leader, a tall man with gray hair and a colonel's insignia, strode forward, his presence like a storm breaking. His name tag read Mitchell. He stopped in front of me, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment the world fell away. The crowd, the kids, the spilled coins. It was just me and him. 2 old soldiers who'd seen too much. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "Sergeant Major Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd like a cannon shot. "It's an honor, sir." I returned the salute, my hand steady despite the years. "Colonel," I said, my throat tight, "didn't expect you here." The crowd gasped, and I saw Jake's face go white, his mouth open like a fish out of water. Sarah fumbled her phone, nearly dropping it. Tyler, the kid who'd flicked the coin, stared at his sneakers, his shoulders hunched. Mitchell's face softened, but his voice stayed strong. "Heard you were in town, Sergeant Major. Couldn't miss the chance to pay my respects." He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them. "This man is Sergeant Major Henry Caldwell, Silver Star recipient for valor in Korea and Vietnam. He saved lives, mine included, and served this country with more courage than most will ever know. You owe him your respect." The crowd erupted, their applause like a wave crashing over me. The man in the flannel shirt started chanting, "Caldwell, Caldwell!" and others joined in, their voices rising in a rhythm that shook the air. Ellen wiped her eyes, her face a mix of pride and awe. A young girl with pigtails clutched a poppy, her mother beaming beside her. I stood there, the tin can in my hands, and felt that ache again. Not pain, but something deeper, like the echo of a life I'd lived for others. Hayes, his clipboard forgotten, stammered, I didn't know, sir. I had no idea." His voice was a squeak, and I cut him off with a look. "No need," I said. "I don't do this for me. I do it for them." I nodded to the tin can, the donations a small piece of something bigger than any of us. Mitchell turned to Hayes, his eyes hard. "This man's got more honor than you'll ever understand. You might want to rethink who you're asking to leave." He gestured to the 2 soldiers behind him, who stepped forward, each holding a small box. "We brought something for you, Sergeant Major," Mitchell said, handing me one. I opened it, my fingers trembling just a bit. Inside was a polished wooden case, and nestled in velvet were new medals, gleaming like they'd just been struck. My old ones, damaged in a fire years ago, were a memory I'd let go of. "Your originals were lost," Mitchell said. "We figured it was time you had these." The crowd gasped, some leaning in to see, others wiping tears. I closed the box, my jaw tight, and nodded. Words didn't come easy just then. The applause swelled, and people surged forward, dropping bills and coins into my tin can. The young girl with pigtails ran up, pinning her poppy to her jacket. "Thank you, mister," she said, her smile brighter than the streetlights. I tipped my cap. "Thank you, little lady." Jake, alone now as his friend slunk away, looked at me, his face a mess of shame and confusion. I didn't know," he mumbled. "I'm sorry." I met his eyes, seeing a kid who'd stumbled but wasn't lost yet. "Learn from it," I said. "That's enough for me." Ellen handed me a bag of pastries, her eyes wet. "For you," she said. "Don't even think about saying no." I chuckled, the sound foreign after the day's wait. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." Mitchell clapped my shoulder. "You're at the memorial ceremony tomorrow, right? Town's dedicating a new one. We need you there." I nodded. "I'll be there." As the crowd dispersed, some lingering to shake my hand or share stories of their own, I stood alone for a moment, the tin can heavier now, the medals tucked under my arm. I looked out at the street, the night settling in, and took a deep breath. I'd come to do a small good, faced a storm, and walked away with my head high. Sometimes that's all the victory you need.